think we'll just wait a minute more or so for people to come in.
One of those glasses that won't keel over.
So you're a professional panelist.
Please. Yeah. I've seen it happen. Thank you.
Okay, let's get the show on the road. Good afternoon, my name is David Batchelor. I'm from the CESAR Joint Undertaking, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel this afternoon on U-Space today. So I'm looking forward to a vibrant discussion about some of the issues around the development of U-Space in Europe. As you probably, I assume most of you know, or all of you know about U-Space and what it is. The CESAR Joint Undertaking published a very high-level blueprint a year or so ago, and since then there's been a lot of work underway. And we have a very good panel covering a cross-section of stakeholders from the drones community. So I really would welcome any questions you want to put up on the Slido tool. Also, there is a question there which you can vote, which is asking you what are the priorities to be addressed by the European institutions to enable the rollout of the U-Space services. So while we're discussing, please give some thought to that question and do vote for which of the options you think is the best one. So I won't introduce everybody individually. The names were up earlier. But I'd like to ask Joachim, you first, perhaps, if you could, from the European Commission perspective, tell us a little bit about how you think we're going with the U-Space development in Europe. We had a very bold and ambitious mandate from the Commissioner to have U-Space operational by 2019. So how are we doing?
Okay, well, thank you, David. I think we have been off to a good start. And that on two dimensions. First of all, I mean, we already mentioned on several occasions today the fact that we are sort of putting the final touches to the implementing and delegated act for drones. Now, they are clearly not pretending to create a fully fledged U-Space. However, they do contain at least requirements for the three foundation services of the U-Space, so on registration, on identification, and on geo-awareness. And in that, I think they are already a first step into the creation of something more elaborate and on which we will be discussing today. And secondly, I would like to brag about the creation of the U-Space demonstrator network. Because very clearly, I mean, some people have kindly applauded us today for working relatively quickly in the creation of the regulatory framework. But the creation of the U-Space demonstrator network really is something which, in my long experience with the Commission, I would like to compare with lightning speed, the speed of light. I mean, I've never seen something created as quickly, which really has a potential to do good in relation to the development of the U-Space. I mean, we have managed to already attract more than 50 projects to that. We have set up a support cell which includes all the important stakeholders. So there's EASA, there is CESAR, there is Eurocontrol. And so together we are trying to federate these different initiatives in Europe in order to get a learning process started, which will then allow us to actually work on the technical specifications of a more complete solution. And let me also advertise that this is not only meetings and talking, but we also had the first demonstrator project on the 14th of November, where NATS was demonstrating a live application in the UK as part of that demonstrator network. So I think these are good seeds, which we have also backed up a bit with money. So it's not only talk, but we put the money where our mouth is, and through CESAR, we have funded 6 demonstrator projects in order to contribute to that learning process and making sure that we have a say in the selection of what is going on. Now, as I said, this is clearly not enough, and there's also no room for complacency. And in order to further open up the market and to move towards a more complete use space, we have to introduce much more automation. And we also need to ensure that this use space we're working on is indeed fully digital and seamless. Now, in terms of the timing and the ambitious targets set by the Commissioner, obviously we're working as much as possible to achieve them, but we also have to be clear this is not an easy exercise. It is complex, and I guess in our discussion we'll see to what extent we actually have enough clarity today as to what precisely we should be regulating, but very clearly we will start now a process which should then lead to use-based regulation in order to provide more clarity as to how the use space should look like in the future.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to ask the other panelists to give a bit of a reaction to that, and also maybe very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, but briefly explain your organization's role in the use space developments, and say what you think is needed from your perspective, what's needed from policymakers or regulators to make use space a reality in Europe. Maybe I'll start with Mark.
My name is Mark. I'm with Unifly, and we are a technology company. We produce use space software that we sell typically to ANSPs or large candidate UTM service providers. In use space, we have been quite involved. We are involved in 4 exploratory research programs. We are involved and very actively involved in 6 of these very large demonstrators. And we are also getting involved in 6 of the UAM projects. From our point of view, use space is advancing at lightning speed. We're quite happy with that. From a technology point of view, a lot has already been created, and things are being demonstrated. We tend to, over the last several months, we have been flying almost on a weekly basis within projects like the Podium project. We've been flying in Denmark, we've been flying in France, we've been flying in Spain. What is needed to really have use space take off? Really 3 things, I think. First of all, good implementation rules, or if I can use the words of manned aviation's, acceptable means of compliance. Just to give an example, tracking of drones is going to be very important in use space. How do you want to do that? Do you want to use ADS-B? Do you want to use satellites? Do you want the 5G network? In what conditions? So there has to be a regulation that tells us what is acceptable. Secondly, I still need a regulatory framework that will define how UTM service providers will have to work together. And how these services will be monetized. The ultimate goal is that if you have a drone operator that normally operates in the UK, and then he goes to do some work in France, how is that going to work? Where does he register? Does he have to register a second time? How is the invoicing? How is the revenue going to work? And last thing, that's something that I have been missing, is how do we integrate the local authorities? Much of the work that we have been doing is look at UTM and use space from an aviation perspective. Now, if we start to think about urban aerial mobility, you have local regulations, the local mayor, the local police commissioner that will have to get involved. And I'm missing some piece of legislation there. So those, for me, are the 3 key areas that need to be resolved for use space to really start to take off.
Thanks. Angela, from an ANSP perspective.
Thank you, David. Yes, my name is Angela Kies. I'm with DFS, the German air navigation services provider. And as we noticed, continuously increasing number of airspace violations around our airfields where we provide our services. we decided like 2.5 years ago to engage in UTM development as well. Just to give you an idea, up until the end of October this year, we noticed in our 16 German airports like 143 of those violations, which when we talk about safety is a very, very big number in aviation. In a research project together with Deutsche Telekom, we could prove that mobile telecommunication infrastructure can be used for the surveillance of UAS in very low-level airspace. So the data provided by this connectivity can be fused together with our existing radar data as well as FLARM or ADS-B or other data sources. So that then means for us that it provides the basis for an integrated situational awareness, for a picture of who is flying where and when. And in our view, this situational awareness is the foundation for the safe operation of drones, especially when they are flying beyond a visual line of sight. So what we think that yes, there are very good foundation and first steps made in use-based regulation, but there is a lot of number, and this is what Mark was referring to, I think, when he talks about the local and regional authorities. There is a lot of questions not solved until now or not answered until now concerning roles and responsibilities in the whole process. So for me or for us as an ANSP, for example, when we talk about the safe integration of drones into the airspace, this includes to look as well on the single European sky concept of the European Union. So I always wonder where is the link between the regulatory period 3, which is already starting in 2020, and use-based regulation. For me, this has to be interlinked because it's just one sky, it's just one airspace in Europe.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to some of those points. Olivier, from a manufacturer's perspective.
Yeah. So hello, I'm Olivier Rea, in charge of UTM solution for Thales. That's true that a lot have been achieved in the last few years at a speed that we are not used to in aviation. The urgent actions, things that need to be done are obviously the publication and endorsement of the EASA regulation in the coming months. I would like to draw your attention on the need for standardization coming both from aviation and non-aviation areas, which is quite a big topic to have those two kind of people talk together and to reach agreement, but that's key because a lot of things are under demonstration or sometimes implemented, but if we do not have the required standard to rely on, it will be useless to show what we are technically capable. And the second point, the other will be a talk across the panel. The last point is not the use-based services development roadmap, but the implementation roadmap. We need to know exactly when the services have to be in operation in order for nations to prepare themselves, for providers to be ready for the scaling up of the solutions, and that's really key. So it's not only a question of technological development, it's also a question of being ready from operational and industrial perspective.
Thank you. And Sean, from Amazon's perspective.
So I don't have to introduce you to Amazon. I'm sure you know a little bit about the company. When I just heard the remark about the Single European Sky initiative, it got me thinking about the work that I've done actually with David and others in the next gen arena. And really it maps over precisely to what we're talking about with U-Space. And it's using technologies, policies, and procedures to maintain or increase a level of safety as you drive up efficiency and capacity. Same as for drones, same as manned aircraft. Now, the way that we get there, and I think that going back to the question, this is going to be proven by these demonstrator events, are using available technologies to be able to have those first instances where you're demonstrating safe and interoperable integration. My cell phone has a lot of the equipage that will be on these generations of drones that are flying right now and will be for the indefinite future because they have computational power, they have sensors, they're Wi-Fi enabled, they're Bluetooth enabled, and they're networked. So that's an example of using an available technology that you can deploy right now to safely have integrated ops in which all the vehicles are talking with each other and thus maintaining safe margins of operations and also communicating with ANSPs and other, public safety agencies and the like. When we talk about beyond technology, about policies and procedures, I think about standards. I think about interoperability standards. So if we have a requirement that our drone operators can communicate with each other and can also communicate with the ANSPs, we have to develop that means by which you have the semantic information that goes back and forth that can be easily translated and easily digested and then used. It doesn't mean that you have the same exact system that an ATM provider would be as an unmanned service supplier would be. It would mean that you figure out the way that they get those types of data, safety critical data, so they can operate safely. And so I think it's really the demonstrator events that we're seeing are going to be the manifestation of these things, deploying technologies that are available right now, having an eye towards emerging technologies, sensor-based things, and everything else that can operate, for instance, integrated communications, integrated GPS environments, and being able to actually demonstrate those in a real-world environment. But the challenge I have to this group is, what happens the day after those events end? What happens the day after that first tranche of demonstrator events happens? And somebody said, what could you do the day after that? Are these going to be snowflakes? Are these going to be kind of one-off, kind of artificial demonstrators that just kind of get over the line? Or are we already thinking about what the next instances are going to be and how we're going to start scaling up those operations? So we do see the aggregate benefits, the societal benefits of all these events happening in concert.
Thanks, Sean. So I think there's clearly different dimensions to this question. There's the technology side of things, standardization, regulatory. My background's as an economist, and I'm actually quite taken by the issues that were raised both by Mark and Angela about roles and responsibilities and how we actually make this into a functioning market in the future, which I think for the time being still remains an unanswered question. But Joachim, do you have any views on what, from a regulatory side of things, how you see that evolving?
Well, I think it will have to be a mixture of a step-by-step approach on the basis of the demonstrator network and the learning that we can take from there, and at the same time a regulatory process which will have to start now in order to provide more clarity as to the interaction of the different participants in the use space, the rules for interoperability, and the way by which they ensure that overall this is safe and that also provides a safe integration into overall use space. Yeah, and being an economist myself, I mean, one of the interesting questions there, of course, is, I mean, will that have to be done by a monopoly provider, or can that be provided by competitive service providers? And we would very much like to see the system develop in the latter direction. And hence, the role of interoperability and clear standards as to the exchange of data and also clear rules, and I heard that and would like to support that on the rules and responsibilities of the different providers of use-based services will become more and more important. But on the other hand, we cannot design them now on a sort of in a room in Brussels. I mean, this is why I want to go back to the fact that this has to be based on what is actually happening on the ground and on the competition that we currently see between technologies and different demonstrator projects in order to enlighten us as to what the best technological solutions for these issues should be.
Okay, so we can take your point that we need to go through this process of demonstrations and so forth, and that will hopefully provide some answers, but I'm nevertheless interested to hear from others on the panel. I think the question you pose yourself, are there aspects of this market which look like they're going to be natural monopolies and other parts of service provision which can be competitive, or can you think everything could be competitive from a use-based service provision kind of point of view? How do you see that? Whether it's in a member state level or at Europe-wide level, are there areas which you think of service provision which lend themselves to monopoly service provision?
The way that things are going, and what we see also worldwide, is that we will enter a very competitive space where in an airspace there will be a multitude of UTM service providers competing for the business. But there is always a role that will be needed or has to be delivered by the current ANSP, and that is all the coordination with manned aviation. Don't forget that we still have the manned aviation out there somewhere. And if you take them out of the equation, then things will start to become very nasty. So I do see that for the ANSP, the monopolist if you want, there's always at least going to be that role. How far do they then want to become the UTM service provider? They could be a UTM service provider, and then again they might not. But that's a choice, an investment choice that they probably will need to make.
Any other perspectives?
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to answer your questions concerning what do we do if we conducted a demonstration or a use case, as we call it in Germany. We take the requirements and the lessons learned and try to implement it in our systems. And therefore, the system is not here like falling from the sky, but it's an incremental development on the learnings we have in our use cases. That's at least how we worked the last 2 years, and I think it was very successful. However, until today, we observe the use-based development as still quite fragmented. There are all single bits and pieces in the different countries. In one country you have already a registration solution, or you have solutions for the authorization, but it's just pieces. It's not the whole system. Even though with the flight trials, they are normally at specific spots. Now everybody tries to make a demo at an airfield because this is a very complex setting, or they try on dedicated operations. But there have hardly been any trials like including more than one operation, for example, like transport and inspection, or bring this together in one piece of airspace. That did not happen until now. And at the end of the day, as all our goal as I believe is the safe integration of UAS into the airspace, all kinds of operations have to be taken into consideration, manned and unmanned. So the solution must be there for drones, for all kinds of drones, and there are very, very different kinds of drones, and it's a very large extent. It has to be there for VFR traffic, it has to be there for IFR traffic, and it has, of course, be there for military traffic as well. And this is different customers who have to be integrated into one system. And I think, therefore, the solution is still missing.
So I think that the way that a system grows safer is through redundancies. And kind of going back to the example that I used of the cell phone, if you think about the way that cellular networks work right now, if you're a T-Mobile or a Vodafone or a Deutsche Tel customer, if your network goes down, if the infrastructure goes down, does your phone still work? Yes, it does. Now it may shift to another network, but there are technical protocols, there are interoperability protocols that provide for that sustenance and for that reliability. And so relating that to the service supplier network, I think that is part of the solution, in which you could have a number of service suppliers, like Mark pointed out, where you could have an ANSP that would possibly act in that role. But in all cases, they would have oversight to ensure that that mosaic of operations of those different use cases are meeting the performance in the safety bar. Risk is risk. It doesn't matter if it's manned or unmanned. You have a certain impact on the airspace, and you have a certain impact on the ground underneath you. I think that if we just think about it in those kind of output-based terms, it's going to be a lot easier to understand how the integration piece works with all these different types of operations.
So we heard this morning from the Commissioner when she spoke in the main hall that she said we can't do everything. We should focus on the core issues for delivery. She wants delivery, and she says to do that, we need to focus on the core issues. So I think, as has been mentioned, there are fragmented bits and pieces here and there. Use-based services cover a lot of different domains. Are there, or what are the core issues that we need to be focusing on in the short term? Maybe, Olivier, I could ask you first.
There have been a lot of discussion in terms of regulation, harmonization, but the first point that when you go to each country, they have different administrative, organizational structure. So it will be complex to have a single set of rules applicable to everyone. So the first point, as I said before, is to publish a regulation to enable countries to implement it concretely into the national regulation. Then the second point, which seems to be really important, is stop to consider only drones. As I said, as it has been said, it's manned and unmanned operations in the same airspace. All the barriers actually in the airspace have been set up by us, not by the nature of operations. And so that's key, that to reconsider the overall airspace and how we safely, securely integrate manned and unmanned operation together. And that's the second point, and for that we need all the demonstrations that are going, but we need maybe to go a step further in that direction. So now we concretely make things work together between manned and unmanned. And the last key point for us is, if possible, rather than focusing on what would be the perfect business model that we do not trust in, we do not see at the end one business model for all the countries. There would be different business models according to the local environment. So rather than focusing on business model, it might be a good idea to focus on key principles: fair and equitable access to the airspace, performance-based services, type of things, decided at the EU level between each nation, set up the KPI to monitor that, and constrain the nation to cope with those principles. And if the UTM service providers or the nations, whatever the business model is implemented, core services, non-core services, centralized, uncentralized, if the performance is not the right one, there is a penalty. And that will make things simple at the end. Let the country implement use-based services as they need, as they can, but let's focus on performance. Are you delivering use-based services at the right performance? When I'm in France or in Germany or in Italy, as a UAV operator, what level of performance can I expect? And that's something that maybe can be done quickly, because it's not so complex to define that type of performance framework, and that will also help to deploy use-based services.
Any other perspectives, Joachim?
I'd like to take a bit of a contrarian view on this issue that currently we are only seeing pieces of the puzzle. I find that neither surprising nor actually a problem. I would rather find it extremely astonishing if somebody was already today demonstrating a use space spanning the whole European Union. But I think what is important is that you see when you look at the development of these demonstrator projects, that every time a dimension of learning is added, yeah, and that the complexity of the operations in the use space is increasing. And that together with the process that we hopefully started of learning from that and also sharing the experiences, and that of course then also only works if the participants to our network are actually engaged in that sharing, I think will be a foundation for creating something in a relatively short period of time. And there I think the colleague is absolutely right that obviously to do that we need to agree on certain basic principles. And that could be principles such as competition wherever possible, interoperability, open access to the data in order to allow a system of systems approach instead of immediately now focusing on one specific technological solution which is being imposed on everyone and which only one or two operators can actually provide in the market.
One of the traps that we fell into when we were contemplating single European skies and next gen was that we created this mythology that suddenly somebody would flip a switch and we would get to next gen. We cannot make that same mistake with U-Space. U-Space is a series of parts that maintain safety and drive up efficiency. The first instances of U-Space can be very simple and very achievable and very safe. And so I think that we're already doing U-Space. We cannot look at this as mythology. We just look at this as something that will always be a system that's evolving. it is always going to be this combination of parts that are evolving together, and I think we need to have that mindset in order not to create these artificial barriers.
Thanks. I'm not sure that in Europe anyone thought we were going to flick a switch on single European sky. Some people might even argue we're still trying to find the switch. Angela.
If I just may add to this, I totally agree. I mean that there is today no full-fledged UTM or U-Space system or functionalities available. That's for sure, because neither the internet was invented in 2 years. So this I see totally the same. But anyhow, I'd like to come back to the idea of having this somehow having the situational awareness as the basis for safety in the three-dimensional airspace. And this has a lot to do with quality check data, even certified data you use for the system. And here is where the paradigm shift of drones entering into airspace becomes reality, that these open systems that are required by the large drones market encounters closed data systems that we now have in ATM or in manned aviation. And there we have to bridge the gap. And I'm totally convinced, I mean, I'm an ANSP, so maybe I have to, but I'm totally convinced that we can learn a lot here from our experiences from the manned aviation world in order to bring this together, and that ANSPs can, if they so want to, play a role as an enabler of all those use-based functionalities that then can be provided by whoever has the technology or feels responsible for a certain technology or functionality in the use-based concept. And this would be then the enabling of the use-based market.
One slightly different question. So I think there's kind of consensus that this is still a work in progress in terms of demonstrations and so forth. But how mature are we in terms of technology? Once these activities are completed, and once in CESAR we have some research projects underway, once they're completed, are we done? Do we need to then just switch into implementation, or is there a need for further research and development activities in the future?
As a technology company, there's already a lot of technology there. It's just a matter of using it. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're just using new technology and trying to put it all together. What is essential is that we have a common vision on how to reuse it. Otherwise, we will never have a service offering which will have a commonality throughout Europe. What we do see is that there are different countries already taking big steps into use-space. They're using similar technology but going different routes. If you want to have that in a common vision, then you have to have a form of standardization.
Any other views?
Well, in my point of view, I'm not a technology provider or an engineer, and maybe the technology we need is there, but there are a lot of detail we do not have considered up to now. I mean, let me give an example. We heard it before. One very, very important user group for UAS, police, disaster management, search and rescue, all those kinds of firefighters, all those kinds of public service providers. And those organizations deal with sensitive data. They won't give their data in clouds overseas. They even do not want to reveal their activities. They did not want to be seen by other operators. So there are all those detailed questions which I do not know if just technology helps us to find the answer to those details.
Joachim.
Again, I would find it very surprising if the technology was entirely mature and no further research and development would be needed. And I mean, for instance, we heard on the last panel that there is a need of more research and also implementation in relation to detect and avoid technologies. I mean, these technologies obviously then also will have a bearing on how the use space is being implemented, because the more drones can detect and avoid each other and engage in machine-to-machine communication, maybe the less steer you have to give them as part of flying in the use space. Similarly, I would expect that there will be still quite a lot of technical improvements based on R&D in areas such as autonomous operations, artificial intelligence, and all this obviously will enhance the capabilities of EU space. But that, in my view, doesn't mean that again, we cannot start, and that it's not possible to roll out something on a wider scale and hopefully on a European level relatively quickly, but it cannot be a system then which we consider to be done like the single European sky, but rather something which needs to be continuously developed on the basis of more applied research and development.
I'll come to you, Sean, but I also want to there's a question from the audience, which is, do you think it's important to make technology neutral regulations for use space, or will that get in the way of standardization?
So I think that if you take an output-based approach, a performance-based approach to technology, you have to have an agnostic attitude towards adopting that. And by that I mean, like, you could have various means of having vehicles communicate with their controllers as long as you have an accepted means by which you develop APIs, the means by which one set of controllers communicates with each other. That could be fairly technology agnostic, but it could still be very effective. There's also technical standards. Dedicated short-range communications is a great example, anti-collision devices for cars. They follow a technical standard defined by IEEE that defines the technical means by which Wi-Fi connected devices communicate with each other. Doesn't mean there won't be other standards, but it's that kind of blend of interoperability through output-based performance standards and also core technical standards, just like the things that define how your radios operate and how the engines in your automobiles are built.
Olivier?
Yeah, very briefly. Coming back to the maturity of technology, if we look at the other roadmap for U0 to U4, Europe, there is a lot of things that are already ready, that have been demonstrated, or a few pieces are missing to demonstrate that it works. And there is some still open question, but that type of open question, as an example, detect and avoid in high density of flying UAS or type of things, will be solved step by step. And in aviation, we like to do things when everything is really mature, fixed, and there is no open question anymore. This is how we do. We have a lot of passengers on board, so that's also why. But here we can proceed in a different way and step by step roll out services when they are mature. So what is important is that regulation, as I said, should not predefine or impose business model, but it should not prevent deployment of services when they are ready, and regulation should not also prevent innovation. It should support. And I'm pretty convinced that at different speed, different paths, but a lot of things can be done right now or in the coming year.
So we're coming towards the end of the panel, and I'm conscious that Luke, who's moderating the next panel, is sitting there with his eyes burning at me. And after his panel, it's a drink, by the way, so we don't want to spend too much time here. But I do want to ask a question about how is the pace of use-based development in Europe comparing with developments in other parts of the world? We often hear, in fact, there's a question from the audience which pre-assumes that Europe is lagging somehow. Is Europe lagging? Is Europe not lagging? What's the perspective from each of your viewpoints?
No, Europe is not lagging. Europe is catching up, and is starting to lead. And I've seen it happen. In preparing this panel, I came to see, okay, where did we start in Europe really start to pick up speed? And I can also almost put a date to it. 2 years ago, when the word U-space was invented, I remember that I had some discussions with some of the colleagues, said, U-space, what's U-space? We have UTM, right? No, now we have U-space. That word has given an identity to a European vision that we need U-space services in a common way in Europe. And I've seen an entire industry come together and start working very diligently together. And I've seen them pick up space at a blistering pace. And I see implementations going faster than anywhere else in the world right now. So are we lagging? No. We are picking up speed, and I think my gut feeling is that we are actually leading the pack.
Sean.
Asking me that question is like asking me to pick my favorite sibling. I'm not going to do it. But I will say that if, like in my case, I compare and contrast the progress that we made in the US versus the progress that we made in Europe, they're very complementary. And let me give you a very concrete example. So we participated in the technical capabilities exercises with NASA. And as part of those TCL events, we demonstrated 5 concurrent operations, communicated with each other, providing separation assurance and contingency management. Okay, that's a great way that you can demonstrate a live interop exercise. Looking towards Europe, they developed the SORA. And the SORA, the Safety Operational Risk Assessment, is being used as the template by which we can get the operational approvals to operate under specific category ops. And they're also using that very same template to fulfill the risk assessment that we have to do with the FAA. So they're very complementary, and I'd say that some like lead or lag in other areas, but in aggregate, they're more or less working in concert. How's that for a dodge?
Thank you. Can I just ask for the voting question to be put up on the... I'm not going to ask for reactions to this, but the question was, what are the priorities to be addressed by the European Union institutions to enable the rollout of new space services? And the winner is the regulatory aspects. But I think there's been a consensus on this panel that things are moving in the right direction. They're moving at a relatively fast pace. There's still plenty to be done. Once we have the results of the research projects, the demonstration activities, that will give us a basis to take the next steps beyond that. And I can't not say that we've also heard that we need more funding for research and development. With that, I'd like to invite you please to join me in thanking the panel, and then we'll hand over to Luke and his following panel. Thank you.
Almost complete. We are missing. Where is he? Ah, yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate the last panel, so that is the good news for you. We have the last part of this day. We have so far discussed a lot about safety. You have discussed a lot about infrastructure, Single European Sky, security. I mean, all those topics have been addressed quite well so far, but we are missing one dimension in this. Today, I would say, if we want to have a big picture on where we go with the drone challenges, and it's the sustainability. It has been said in the various statements this morning, in particular Commissioner Bulk, I mean, was quite vocal in the impact on the drones on the environment, and she repeated that we should not forget it. And in fact, if you want to go into that topic this afternoon, what we would like to discuss here with the panel is two dimensions. First,
how can the drone possibly contribute to reduce the impact on the aviation on the environment, and how can it could improve sustainability of air transport. But the other facet, the other aspects we would like to see here, how can we avoid that the development, emergence of the drones, the drone market, cannot generate new type of environmental challenge and difficulties. That's the two elements we will try to discuss here. And for this, I have to indicate that one person will not be part, it's on your program, will not join us, has had problems to join us, water as well, so there's some health problem this afternoon, so will not be with us. But the team here present is really solid and ready to contribute to that exchange of views. I will raise the first question to the panel is, in fact, to see if, do you see among the drone applications candidates for helping to reduce the impact on the climate change and the environmental pressure the growth of traffic is doing? Do you have any good signs of potential applications? Who would like to be the first?
I can go first if you like. I think it's a great question that is better to think about in terms of those systems that you're talking about. How can aviation and in particular drone aviation contribute to systems that need more sustainability? So a couple examples that I think of go across the logistics framework, the people transport framework, and even the data collection framework when we think about how we might use unmanned vehicles. An example in the data framework that we talked about earlier was data gathering from drones in agricultural scenarios where they can feed in more specific data about water needs, about other spraying needs, and give the operators a more precise idea of where and what to do for their farms, for example. Congestion, if we can start to break that down on the roads by developing urban air mobility solutions like air taxis or unmanned logistics, I think that would also contribute to the sustainability of our mobility system itself, our infrastructure itself.
Thank you. Other examples, maybe in your mind?
Yeah. Does this work? Well, of course, as you know, because we've discussed this previously, I'm involved in developing drone technology for wind energy applications. And in general, I think what we're trying to achieve there is to replace hardware, steel and concrete with control system technology and software. And I do think that this is only one example of where robotization, I would say, may, and thereby using airspace knowledge, may actually help replace hardware material and used material in a smarter way. So I think that from my point of view, our example may be one of those examples.
I'm sure there are others.
I would start with replacing current operations like power line inspections, general inspections, building inspections by the use of drones to, on the one hand, make operations more efficient, cost efficient, and on the other hand, to keep the human out of the loop, not having him flying in a helicopter at maybe not so safe situations.
Yes, and if I may add, from EASA perspective, from a regulatory perspective, it's very often about facilitating, and I think we've heard a lot about what the draft EU regulation can do to facilitate, and I think that's the main task here, to make sure that we are facilitating these new technologies that can help reduce climate impact, noise, local air emissions. As one of the examples here in that context, I'd like to mention the EASA electric and hybrid aviation project. Because that's linking and facilitating also the introduction of these areas which are a bit overlapping with what we're talking about today. It's not only unmanned, but it certainly will have an impact on the overall environmental footprint and sustainability of aviation.
Thank you. We have seen this morning a few examples of solutions for vehicles, in particular the possibility to have to transport 4 persons. Is it something which is done take into account the greening commitment, or what are your views on the developments of the new vehicles, like a bus for 4 persons? Is it something which is realistic?
Yeah, they're depending on the requirements that are put out there by different companies. We heard Uber talking this morning. They have their own concepts. Bell as well as Aurora, we are working for Uber, developing vehicles. And yeah, there's a certain range of the size of those vehicles, 2 to 4 people on board, passengers. And with current battery technology, we think we are able to have something in this range. But thinking about a bus that is transporting many more people, that's probably not in the range that we think of right now. But depending on the passengers on board, of course, our range that we can operate in is decreasing. So currently we are thinking of 15 minutes flight times, ranging up to like 50 kilometers, maybe up to 50 miles sometime in the next 5, 6, 7 years. But this is the current range we are working with.
Yeah, at Bell, we're looking to target a 4+1 configuration, and we think first and foremost that's the better business case, and thinking about sustainability and efficiency. You want to obviously hit that right business case, not have your deadheads, and you know, make sure you can get all the right folks on board going to the same place at the same time. As far as time periods go, we talk about it in the mid-2020s, late 2020s as a viable solution. And we also look at it as a journey towards more electric. At Bell, we're going to start with a hybrid electric solution, and we think that's the proper path to shake down the distributed propulsion systems that many of the on-demand mobility platform representatives are talking about. And that'll bring us to the right point where we can go all electric after that and achieve that zero emission state. So I think it's very doable. I think I agree. After that, it becomes a more difficult question in terms of size, but perhaps that's where the fixed wing folks could start to pick up a little bit of the steam for us. In the VTOL areas that Manuel and I work in, you typically need 4 to 5 times more power for a given mission, and that's a lot to take on when you're thinking about more electric aviation. But I think there's great cases in the fixed wing world as well.
You speak about electricity as a solution. Are there other possibilities to develop new solutions? I mean, the Commissioner said, let's innovate also in propulsion. Do you have any magic solutions there?
I don't know about magic, but I'll keep looking. I think another interesting area is fuel cells. I think it's in the early days right now for aviation, in particular aviation that Bell's interested in, but we certainly think that's something that we can look at. There are challenges around hydrogen storage, but there's some indications that there are different types of fuel cells that could be more cyclically sustainable from well to wing if we can use plant-based fuels. But there are early studies right now, but it's something of interest for us.
Any other views on
Well, maybe one element on, because we had a conversation about does it make more sense to have an electric bus carrying a certain number of passengers or taking an air taxi from an environmental perspective. I think in that context we have to come back to the notion of the intermodality and the city sustainability. So there will be certainly areas where, as we've heard this morning, where the third dimension is needed, and then it will make, from a sustainability perspective, a lot of sense to go into the third dimension. But it has to be looked at as from a system perspective to really have a good understanding of the climate impact.
anything else? I'm sure you have something to propose there.
Yes. Yeah, so like I mentioned before, so my field of business is energy, And in the energy sector, we see, of course, that there is a large push for, specifically coming from the oil and gas industry, to reuse as much as possible the existing infrastructure assets that those companies possess. From that point, I see that a lot of focus is being put now on technologies that convert power to gas, and looking at the, let's say, the patent space around that, those inventions. What I see happening is that indeed hydrogen is one of the fuels that's being looked at, but more importantly, also methanol and methane type of fuels are being looked at right now. I think overall what you have to look for if you're looking for sustainability is the full life cycle energy costs, so including manufacturing, mining of components needed to actually generate the batteries. And I do think that one of the interesting remarks was made by one of the panelists, where also, as far as I understand, Bell is looking at the, let's say, the second life aspects of aviation batteries, and I thought that was quite interesting actually, so maybe give it back to you.
Yeah, I thought of two things while you were talking. Another interesting technology aspect that we often push to the side because we're always talking about more electrified propulsion is that autonomy is actually a contributor to sustainability because it removes an otherwise non-paying passenger from the efficiency equation, and that amounts to nothing more than fuel. So we would use less in theory without that pilot on board. Won't always be available to all the missions, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of sustainability. And I appreciate the lead-in for the multiple use. We were talking about how aviation batteries, in particular, in our example at Bell, for VTOL or eVTOL vehicles, they need high power density in the VTOL portion and high energy density in the cruise portion. That results in a particular chemistry selection that you would make for the vehicle, a particular packaging selection you'd make for the vehicle. And then for as far as operating at a certain duty cycle for that given mission, whether it's logistics or people moving, you would have certain performance parameters that create your boundaries. And once those battery packs fall below those standards that are appropriate for our given vehicles, I think we need to look.
I would like to come back to the battery question later on.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. In the meantime, I would like Kai to give us, because there are many regulators here in the room. I mean, maybe this is something they are all asking for. It's clarification. What the regulator should be doing in order to get this acceptability, this acceptance, public acceptance regarding noise, annoyance, and emission. I mean, we see that there are some solutions coming, but what the regulator should be doing here?
Well, I think with noise is of course one of the elements to watch out for. We want to create a market. We want to facilitate this industry, and noise is arguably one of the elements to watch out for. Citizens are concerned about that element. You look around airports, discussions on airport expansions, and you know what kind of dynamic this can create. So this is definitely an area to look out for, or should I say here for, I guess. So this is an important element. What should the regulator do? Well, I think in the draft EU drone regulation, what you have already is an element of a requirement, of a noise requirement, and a flexibility at member state level to implement in geographical zones. So this is a tool set that is proposed there as a starting point for the open category, for sure. But it's something that we believe is a good starting point for the discussions. We know generally from aviation how standards can help to create confidence with stakeholders. Knowing that we are supposed to innovate, it's probably worth mentioning that noise was also the first requirement on commercial air transport. That was where a standard was created, and of course, quite a long time after the operation started, or the market was created. So I think here we are already ahead of the pack with the idea of getting it right from the start. So that's I think an important element in this. Now, of course, the question is looking ahead. Here we are really in listening mode. What to do about the certified category, urban air mobility, how to get the standard right in this area and facilitate the entry into the creation of a market. This is an area where we're working on and where we send us emails, talk to us. We are ready to hear any ideas on how to do that with the right level.
Thank you. Is industry working on this, and what are your expectations in terms of level of performance, in terms of annoyance? I mean.
Yeah, I guess of course noise is in everybody's mind, and we are working on this, and we are hoping for some like a tight limitation or a tight threshold that is accepted in the regulators world, where we think of like higher noise levels close to busy intersections or so, whereas in residential areas there should be not that much noise to be allowed to protect the citizens there. So it needs to be a threshold defined that is depending on the flight phase, like whether it's hovering or if it's in level flight, where it's certainly less noisy, at least in our case with fixed wings. And then the duration of flight is another component in there. And of course the geographical area, where residential areas compared to otherwise busy areas could have different levels.
Maybe not everybody is aware, and I'm sorry to raise that question now without having an early warning, but I mean, I would like you to explain the level of noise we have achieved today in terms of quality. Which type of source of noise could you compare currently, what is under development, and what people know today?
You mean for the specific vehicle?
Yes.
I think that's still in the definition phase, and we will see how that turns out with the actual vehicle in the end.
Okay, so no reference yet? Yes? Yeah.
Just from a generic standpoint of how distributed electric propulsion would help in that area, tip speed is one of the main drivers in rotorcraft for noise, and having a distributed system with smaller diameter rotors will help bring that tip speed down. And we've done some pretty encouraging tests in that area that have made significant changes to our noise profile. Manuel also mentioned that converting to a wing will take the time of the loudest portion of the emissions down as far as a VTOL aircraft is concerned, the so-called powered lift, where you get on a wing and barely know that the aircraft is there. And there's a lot of encouraging work on our part in that area. We have a history of it with the tilt rotor. You kind of live it as it's flying by. You don't notice much in cruise. It can be louder on the VTOL side, but it's a big aircraft. These are going to be smaller aircraft that have less energy involved for their lift-off portion.
Thank you. Now I would like to go back to the budget. Sorry.
If I may, just two elements which are not directly related to regulation, but I think they are important enablers that we need to think of. Of course, there's a question on research. This is a step-by-step approach. So here's a lot of things to learn about the way we should best measure the kind of noise that's being generated with new flight patterns. What about the annoyance? Because there's a difference between noise levels and the perception of people. So there's issues there to be looked into, which I think are important to facilitate again the market. And questions maybe for tomorrow on promotion and community outreach. Noise has a lot to do also with people's perception. You talk to people and their perception changes. I think you mentioned also this experience at Bell. So I think these are important elements to complement whatever we're doing in this area to facilitate the market. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
Well, I think one of the more striking examples that you provided in our earlier discussions was about the actual use case for the noise. So if it's directed towards first aid or emergency services, that the annoyance level is significantly higher or more tolerant than if it's recreational, for instance. And I think that was a very striking example of how noise perception and tolerance is actually related to each other. So I think that's
Yeah, I
an
think
important one as well.
the communication part of it is very, very critical for industry and all the regulators to do together with our communities, so that we understand what we're doing with the vehicles, how they contribute to society. Access also, if we make these vehicles inaccessible to a broader set of folks for their daily mobility solutions, that automatically excludes and automatically changes the perception of the public, and we're striving to make a vehicle that is accessible for your daily mobility solutions.
Now I would like to go to the battery issue. So, what is your what are your views on the life cycle of the battery, the impact on the environment? I mean, this is already on the table. I mean, recycling does not seem easy to be achieved for lithium batteries. So, what are the ideas here to get the smallest impact as possible on the environment? Who would like to start? Yes.
Yeah, just continuing where I was, and I apologize for getting ahead of that a little bit. This idea that the aviation battery, whether it's a VTOL application or a fixed wing application, is a different chemistry, a different packaging, ideally for the mission at hand. And then there'll be certain boundaries for remaining charge, duty cycle that we would not violate in the aerospace market, but could be acceptable in other applications such as ground transportation or grid applications. And I think that, besides just the raw recycling of the materials, which you noted as pretty difficult, would help use the actual batteries themselves for a longer time period. And I think that's a very interesting possibility, given the differences that you find in the necessary technologies for these different applications.
Anybody else on the battery?
Yes, maybe one element to look ahead. If we see noise as maybe one of the imminent problems that is on people's mind, I think this one is an important one, because we're talking about environmental impact which are relevant. We're talking in the end away from the batteries, where I think also the automotive industry has to look for solutions. There's a possibility to pass on batteries to other users that don't need the same energy density. But in the end, what remains is a need for this new emerging market, which is likely to increase energy usage, because we are opening new market. We are delivering services that didn't exist before. So it has to fit in the overall climate action context. And I think that's the context here, where probably thinking of what you also mentioned, a cradle-to-grave approach, life cycle assessment for the product is an interesting thought that would also link to climate actions and the circular economy concept. So more to think ahead.
Nobody else? So staying on circular economy, I mean, and it's a question from the floor. We had, I'm sorry you cannot see that, but I have an eye on them. There will be a lot of drones. That was what we have learned today. What is the state of reflection on the recycling of the drone material? I mean, did you reflect on that?
The
recycling
of the drone itself?
Yes.
We've worked a couple projects looking at research projects looking at recyclable composites and their applicability. It's always a challenge with those types of materials to get the allowables correct for aerospace application, but it's encouraging to think about that possibility for some secondary structure, at least today, where you can take that graphite material and the resin systems and reconstitute them. So that's been really encouraging. I think programs like REACH that have been are looking at the chemistries that go into finishing the aircraft or maintaining the aircraft are really important. I know EASA plays a big role in that in Europe as well. So we look to comply with those and exceed those expectations as well for the vehicle itself, outside of the new propulsion systems in the electric propulsion regime.
Staying on the environment, because it's really where we are this afternoon. there is a question which has a lot of support here. I mean, did you have any reflection on work preparatory studies, impact assessment on how drones will fly in the presence of birds, how that will be coexist? I mean, this is a question which seems to be very popular here. Yeah.
This is actually interesting. I just got to know somebody 2 weeks ago, and that woman approached me and asked me if we consider drones, of birds in our drone operations, and I was kind of surprised by this approach. But it's probably something that we need to account for, and there are companies out there that monitor bird populations in city environments, and that's a whole new ecosystem that we need to create, and maybe that's part of it to account for.
Should be part, okay.
Yeah.
From a safety standpoint, I think it's critical for the vehicle to consider that as well. These vehicles are, especially when they are distributed, need to be able to have the redundancy and reliability for those interactions to take place and be able to safely land. When you think about the birds themselves, I think there's, as Manuela mentioned, systems of tracking patterns, and I also read recently about some technology that could actually discourage the birds from their own operations in and around our operations, so that may be something interesting to look at as well.
Is hydrogen a solution for drones? I don't know who wants to take that one. You would like to?
Yes, of course. I think so. From the combustion point of view, obviously, if you have a fuel where the only emission is water, that would generally help the CO2 problems that we are trying to solve. On the other hand, and I think that's part of the gist of the earlier discussion, we're talking about energy, so you need to have a holistic view on what you're doing. To reflect back to your previous question, recycling is only relevant if it provides a positive energy balance. I know what we've looked at our application for recyclability of certain materials, and I was actually amazed to find that most of these materials, if you burn them in an incinerator, you produce energy, and that is actually a better way than recycling most of the materials. So from that point of view, I think you should look at all aspects of let's say, environmental impact on each and every of the assumptions that you make. So including the hydrogen economy, let's say, if ultimately by compressing and storing and transporting, you ultimately produce a negative energy balance, then this is not a solution that's sustainable. And I think that will be the big discriminator, and not if it's technically feasible. But again, I think that we need to look at the economy on the largest possible scale and start focusing on the actual energy costs and not on the monetary cost of these technologies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, because as hydrogen as a case, there's, as we all know, there's a lot of energy in there. So when you see that, you say, well, I better go for it. It must be the answer. But to be responsible about it and think about the entire system is wise.
Thank you. I think we will close this panel at this stage. I think we have been working the whole day, so and I would like, I think, I would like you to join me to thank the panel, which has been contributing to a quite, I would say, challenging dimension of the drones, which cannot be forgotten. So if you can join me to applaud for this effort. Two last things before, we definitively leave for today this room. First, don't forget that there is a competition for universities. I've been walking through the candidates. I think I really find it very, very interesting. So if I can invite you before the closing of the day to do that and to give them a chance to be seen. And the second one, we invite you for a networking cocktail outside this room, and that will be the last part of your day. And we wish you, beyond that, a nice evening. Thank you. Sorry, drone area. So the cocktail is in the drone area, as it is indicated in the program. The drone area, we have to leave this area and going to the exhibition. Yes.
Almost wrong.
Yes. Thank you very much.